original image looked like. It's called the Mandelbrot set. Now this is an icon, ladies and gentlemen. This is a deity for scholars and philosophers of science who like to quote chaos. And it is a big revolution. They think that they're making progress towards understanding reality. But I say hokum, because chaos is a lie. At least the way these men use it. Now watch. Why? Because when Mandelbrot sat down to make this experiment, he had to do several things. He had to decide how to do it. He had to create a hypothesis. He had to follow that hypothesis. He had to write down a hypothesis. Every single word in that hypothesis was a product of intention, not chaos. Now, when he actually came to the point of actually feeding these chaotic systems into a computer, he had to use a software program. Each and every bit of that software program was a byproduct of a decision by an intelligent person, not chaos. Now, when he finally got ready and he fed all this disparate chaotic information into the system, what he had to do? He had to make a drawing to start the whole thing off. So he had to arbitrarily choose an image out of which the chaos would flow. That's not chaos either. That's another choice, right? So what he wrote in the end of his book was that every single step of my experiment was in defiance of chaos, because every single step required a decision. So where did the chaos go in this equation, ladies and gentlemen?
The colour. It looks like Betty Boop's spectrum.
It does look like Betty Boop, doesn't it? Betty Boop. Now, why am I rattling about this? Is it important, or am I just showing off how much I know about a terribly boring bit of minutia? Why is it important to the discussions of Bhakti Yoga, Krishna consciousness, or Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mission?
Because the atoms are sacred. Everything's sacred.
Can you say that a little louder?
Everything in the world is supposed to be sacred. Even atoms, everything. It's God's energy, it's sacred.
Pedro says everything is sacred. Beautiful. What else? What else? Please, help me out. Why am I talking about chaos in a Krishna temple? Why am I...
I've got a good one.
Yes?
Are we saying that the atoms are, there's some kind of consciousness within them?
There's a consciousness within the atom. Yes, thank you. And who else raised their hand?
I was going to say something.
William.
I was going to say that actually with oil and paint, you can create a similar kind of effect. But before we had oil and paint, people were using eggplant to do this kind of thing. And that's quite a good example of the living entity and how much we can respect it now.
Vipul?
Kunar.
I'm sorry, Kunar. Sorry.
I just think there's no such thing as chance. Nothing happens by chance at all.
That's my thesis. Thank you for cutting to the chase.
Okay.
Please ask any questions. I'm going to rattle on and try to make my dissertation concise and come to a point. But please feel free to share with us anything you want to interject. Now look at this. This is one of the first stages of the Mandelbrot production, and you can see the color separations before it was turned into color. You see how these look like lightning? Now that's very interesting. No, what you find here is another Mandelbrot set replicated. And if you multiply that up to 450 million times, you get to experience what looks like the passage from one layer of the universe into another. Remember those 12th century, 13th century paintings of the universe that were also woodcuts? And you'd see in the bottom, some of them, in the bottom left-hand corner, you'd see a guy breaking out of the universe and looking out into the stars as though he cracked it, right? And in the same way, with the technology of fractals, we're observing an enormously beautiful landscape, and you find the fulcrum, okay, there it is. And you go into that, and you multiply it 450 million times, and pretty soon you're in a new landscape where everything is different, and it's amazingly beautiful, and it looks like a work of art. For instance, have a look at this one. This is I think this is the Julia set, which is a derivation of the Mandelbrot set. But recently there was a documentary called The Secret Life of Chaos, and it was an 1.5-hour long documentary full of waffle. And these scientists were priding themselves on using chaos, chance, and kind of rubbernecking kind of notions of chemical and DNA mistakes. They refer to them as errors. They're still using words like junk DNA because they don't know it's junk. But what we find in DNA, like lightning, we find an amazing encryption of quality of information and content of information in a lightning bolt, but it's microscopic. And again, we talk about this, I'll cut to the chase shortly. Again, we see in CAT scans, brain activity, MRIs, EKGs, EEGs, if you hooked up my brain to an EEG, you put electrodes all over my head, right? And then if I were to ask you a series of questions over a period of an hour, we can observe the relationship between thought quality and the regions of the brain which are processing those thoughts. You know this. I'll tell you a little bit in detail anyway. Again, I use the analogy, well, this is their analogy. If I were to say, what would you do if I hit your toe with a hammer? Then the brain, the lower medulla oblongata, the primitive part of the brain, would start to fire off a very narrow sliver of electromagnetic activity. And that would precipitate a neurochemical neurotransmission event which would allow us to respond effectively. Now, if I were to ask you what's your favorite color, the parietal lobe in the cerebellum, a very small sliver, would start to activate an electromagnetic impulse, which would then allow us to respond, well, blue. And then, if I were to ask you, yeah, it's like an electromagnetic thunderstorm, but only in that little tiny part of the brain which is isolated to deal with that thought quality. And it happens on a regular basis. It's like a machine. But if I were to ask you, what will you be doing after this life? Where will you go after death? Again, the whole brain starts to light up. And guess what? Atato Brahma Jigyasa, the Vedanta Sutra says, now that you've arrived at the human form of life, here you go. Please, 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 inquire into the absolute truth. Experiment with the journey of self-realization, because you don't get it in any other species. Or at least that's a subtext to this Mahavakya. Now, if we take that a little further and we examine electricity, we see something going on that's very similar to the power of intention. Now, if you look at this sound chamber again, or rather this this is an atom, but it also, doesn't it echo the solar system? If this were the sun, doesn't this look like the orbit of a planet? Even though the orbit of the planets are ellipsoidal. In our solar system, we have layers of density. And the further out you go, the densities change. But when they shoot these bullets in here, what happens? All of a sudden, one shell will collapse into the other shell, and it will build a new shell. That's also not chaos. So how is it that we have the intelligence to observe an atom behaving intelligently if there's not order and design implicate to the whole sequence of cause and effect? In other words, Krishna says in the Brahma Samhita, or rather, Lord Brahma says in the Brahma Samhita. Who knows this verse? Prabhu, you can help me. Anantarasta paramanu chayantarastam. Where Krishna enters into every atom in his fullness. You know that? Lord Brahma says Krishna is holographically present in his entirety. His whole being enters into every single atom, spread across space. Now, if that were the case, wouldn't we want to test that? And if we could test it, we would have to enter the atom. And if we could enter the atom, we would expect to see a holographic echo of the macro system in the micro system. Am I making sense? Am I talking over anyone's head? Don't be ashamed to say, I need to hear that again.